The airplane shot through the sky, its cabin lights casting a warm glow on the faces of passengers from all walks of life. Busy businessmen, small families, and travelers lost in thought as they gazed out the window. Everything seemed normal until a name echoed through the first-class cabin, sending a ripple of shock across the room. Clint Eastwood? Is that really Clint Eastwood? A wave of murmurs spread. Every eye turned toward the aisle, where a tall man with a commanding yet slightly weary presence was stepping in. He didn't need to speak. His mere presence was enough to freeze the atmosphere. But then, something happened that no one could have expected. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm terribly sorry, but there has been an issue with your booking. First class is completely full." The entire cabin fell silent. A Hollywood legend being forced to move to economy class? No one could believe it. And in that very moment, a single small decision changed the course of two lives forever. A young man quietly stood up, stepped toward the living legend, and spoke a sentence that left everyone on that flight in stunned silence. That moment, a simple yet profound decision was made. One that seemed insignificant at the time, yet would alter the destiny of both men forever. The golden glow of the cabin lights stretched across the first-class section of the transcontinental flight. The soft clinking of wine glasses, the low murmur of businessmen engaged in quiet conversations, and the occasional giggle of a playful child created a lively yet undeniably sophisticated atmosphere. Seated by the window, Barron Trump, 17 years old, the youngest son of a former U.S. president, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the sky outside. He was used to flights like these, just as he was used to the curious glances and hushed whispers whenever someone recognized him. Flipping open the menu, Barron had just begun to scan through the meal options when a sudden ripple of excitement swept through the cabin. The murmurs grew louder, turning into hushed but unmistakably animated chatter. A few passengers twisted in their seats, craning their necks toward the aisle. Businessmen, who moments ago had been engrossed in their laptops, now lifted their heads. "No way. Is that really him?" Barron furrowed his brows, following their gaze. A tall man with a commanding presence but a hint of wariness in his step was making his way down the aisle. He was not dressed in a designer suit, nor did he hide behind dark sunglasses like many Hollywood celebrities. Instead, he wore a simple jacket, well-worn leather boots, and carried an air of quiet authority that was instantly recognizable. Clint Eastwood. There was no need for confirmation. One glance was enough for anyone to recognize the living legend of Hollywood. His sharp eyes, his weathered yet resolute face, bore the unmistakable marks of time, but he still carried himself with the presence of a man who had lived through battles, both on and off the screen. Barron blinked. He knew the name well. A man who had spent his entire career portraying heroes that never backed down, characters larger than life. But tonight, here, in reality, he seemed different. There was something in his gaze, something subtle but undeniable. A quiet exhaustion. A king without a throne, walking among the crowd, but this time there was no red carpet laid before him. And then, it happened. A flight attendant hurried over, her expression uneasy. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm terribly sorry, but there has been a booking error." A flicker of confusion passed through the cabin. Barron narrowed his eyes slightly. A booking error? The flight attendant hesitated, biting her lip as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She could feel the attention of the entire first-class section on her. First class is completely full. The air inside the cabin seemed to shift. Clint Eastwood had no seat in first class? A Hollywood legend. One of the most powerful figures in the film industry. And now, there wasn't a place for him in the most elite section of the plane? It was hard to believe. Barron instinctively glanced at the other passengers. Some had begun whispering to one another. A few exchanged puzzled looks, while others simply waited, eyes darting between Clint and the flight attendant. A handful of them seemed visibly uncomfortable, as if they couldn't quite process the absurdity of what was unfolding. But the strangest thing was that Clint Eastwood didn't seem upset. He just stood there, his gaze steady as he looked at the flight attendant. No anger, no frustration, not even the slightest trace of indignation, just a quiet nod. "I understand." His voice was low, rough, but remarkably calm. He was about to turn and walk toward the economy section when A voice rang out. It wasn't loud, it wasn't commanding, but it was enough to send a jolt through the cabin, silencing every murmur in an instant. "Sir, you can take my seat." Barron Trump had risen from his chair, all eyes snapped toward him. A ripple of surprise swept through first class. A few passengers stared, their expressions unreadable. Barron was not a seasoned businessman. He was not a veteran politician. He was just a 17-year-old boy, one who had spent much of his life standing in the shadow of his family name. Yet in that moment, with a single quiet decision, he had drawn the attention of everyone in that cabin. And from that moment on, everything began to change. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin froze. A few passengers stopped mid-bite, while others slowly set their wine glasses down. An eerie silence blanketed the space, broken only by the steady hum of the airplane's engines and the faint, held breaths of those witnessing the moment. Clint Eastwood, a man who had faced down ruthless gunslingers on screen, now stood motionless, his sharp gaze locked onto the young man before him. He wasn't surprised by the offer. Throughout his life, he had encountered his fair share of kind people. But what made him pause wasn't the gesture itself. It was the boy's eyes. There was no pity in them, no fanboy admiration, just sincerity, pure and simple. "Sir, you can take my seat." Barron Trump did not hesitate, did not waver. Some passengers exchanged glances. A few nodded subtly, murmuring among themselves. A distinguished-looking man in an Armani suit raised an eyebrow, then shrugged, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. A female executive pressed her lips together, her expression unreadable, yet her gaze lingered on the boy a moment longer. Clint raised an eyebrow slightly. He was not the type to hesitate, but this time he hesitated. "Are you sure?" His voice, deep and gravelly, carried the weight of a lifetime of battles. Some fought with fists, others with words. Barron simply nodded, a faint smile forming at the corner of his lips. "I just want to do the right thing." A simple sentence, but one that carried more weight than any speech ever could. Clint remained silent for a long moment. Then finally he gave a slow nod. "All right, kid." His hand rested lightly on Barron's shoulder, as if testing whether the boy was second-guessing his choice. But Barron stood firm, unwavering, his expression steady, the look of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. As Clint Eastwood lowered himself into the plush first-class seat, a few flight attendants exchanged glances, their expressions betraying their astonishment. They hadn't expected this. No one had expected this. A teenager giving up his seat, not for personal gain, not for recognition, but simply because it felt like the right thing to do. Barron didn't wait for anyone's reaction. He turned and walked toward the economy cabin. And at that exact moment, something no one could have anticipated happened. At the front of first class, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard slowly set his glass of wine down, watching Barron's retreating figure. His brows knitted together slightly, as if trying to recall something distant yet significant. At the back of the cabin, a flight attendant stood frozen, her eyes reflecting admiration as she followed the young man's steps. For one brief moment, first class had changed. No one was only thinking about themselves anymore. But this was just the beginning. Because in the economy section, where Barron was heading toward a cramped seat between a chatty salesman and a young mother struggling to soothe her crying child, nightmare was about to unfold. Barron fastened his seatbelt, leaning back into the cramped seat, trying to adjust to the limited space. Unlike the first-class cabin, with its wide leather seats and elegantly served wine, this section was crowded, noisy, and slightly chaotic. To his left, a salesman had already started rambling about some business deal. To his right, a young mother swayed gently, attempting to calm her wailing infant. Barron didn't mind. He simply slipped on his headphones, intending to sleep through the flight. But he had no idea that this flight was about to turn into a nightmare. 15 minutes after takeoff, the captain's voice echoed through the speakers, announcing that the journey was proceeding smoothly. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, serving dinner. Some passengers flipped through magazines, while others immersed themselves in work on their laptops. Everything seemed stable. And then, bang! A violent jolt tore through the cabin, shattering the tranquility. The airplane trembled fiercely, sending meal trays crashing to the floor, drinks spilling, and a few phones slipping from passengers' hands. Screams erupted. Barron gripped the armrests tightly. He could feel the turbulence outside, the powerful gusts of wind slamming against the aircraft as if trying to rip it apart. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. The flight attendant's voice was sharper, more urgent than before. Passengers who had been lost in their own worlds only moments ago were now gripped by fear. The once chatty salesman beside Barron had turned pale. His hands clenched tightly around the seat. The baby beside him cried even louder. Another wave of turbulence hit, even more intense than before. Overhead compartments rattled violently. Luggage tumbled down, slamming onto seats and aisles. A passenger let out a terrified shriek as an oxygen mask suddenly dropped in front of them. In first class, Clint Eastwood sat motionless, but his hands had clenched around the armrests. Throughout his decades-long career, he had filmed countless scenes of danger, gunfights, explosions, death-defying stunts. But this time, this wasn't a movie. This was real. Crack. A sharp, chilling noise pierced the air. For a split second, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. Barron turned his head, his eyes landing on the salesman beside him. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. The young mother next to him clutched her baby against her chest, silent tears streaming down her face. Outside the window, lightning slashed through the darkness, illuminating the stormy sky in flashes of white and blue. The airplane rocked violently, tilting heavily to one side before suddenly dropping several meters in free fall. Passengers screamed. Barron's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't scream. He simply took a deep breath. In first class, Clint Eastwood turned his head toward the economy section, and in the midst of the panicked faces, he saw Barron. Amid the chaos, amid the desperate cries, the 17-year-old boy sat there, gripping the armrest tightly, his expression unwavering. At that moment, Clint realized something. There are people who are born to face adversity, and this young man was one of them. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the aircraft an eerie silence enveloped the cabin. After moments of chaos, the plane gradually steadied. The overhead cabin lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. A calm yet slightly tense voice came through the intercom. "We have passed through the turbulence. Please remain calm. The flight crew will now assess the situation." Passengers exhaled in relief, but no one was truly at ease. Some still clutched the armrests tightly, while others exchanged quiet glances, as if silently confirming to each other that they were still alive. In the economy section, Barron slowly loosened his grip, feeling the tingling sensation in his fingers from having clenched them too tightly. He looked around. Beside him, the salesman was trembling as he wiped the sweat from his forehead, while the young mother continued to cradle her child, whispering softly, perhaps a prayer of gratitude. Barron didn't say a word. He merely glanced down at his own hands, where faint crescent-shaped marks from his nails had pressed into his skin. He had endured storms before, whispers behind his back, judgmental gazes, the weight of being a Trump. But this was the first time he had truly felt the thin line separating life from death. And at that precise moment, a tall figure entered the economy cabin. Clint Eastwood. No one spoke, yet every eye followed him. A man who had just come from the luxury of first class, now stepping into this cramped, crowded space, for one reason only. He was looking for Barron. Their eyes met. No words were spoken at first, but it wasn't the silence of awkwardness or uncertainty. It was the silence of two people who had just gone through something far greater than themselves. Clint placed a hand on the back of the seat in front of Barron, tilting his head slightly, his deep, gravelly voice carrying effortlessly over the hushed cabin. "Is the seat taken?" Barron was surprised, but he didn't hesitate. Barron remained silent for a long time. Then he spoke. "I just thought, sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference." On the other end of the line, Clint chuckled softly. "Exactly. That's what I want to capture." The idea took shape. A year later, The Power of One was released. From the moment it hit theaters, The Power of One was not just a movie, it became a movement. People walked out of cinemas with teary eyes. Stories of kindness flooded the internet. Hashtag spread like wildfire. / kindness matters. The power of one. Be the change. News articles didn't just review the film, they shared real-life acts of kindness inspired by it. A man paid off a stranger's tuition fees. A young woman helped a homeless man, only to realize he was her former teacher. An elderly couple began writing letters of encouragement to cancer patients they had never met. It all started with a moment on a plane. And in the end, when Barron stood on the stage at the award ceremony, looking down at the standing ovation that refused to die down, he was no longer just Barron Trump, the son of a former president. He was the young man who had taught the world a lesson in kindness. Before stepping off the stage, he said one simple sentence, one that would resonate in the hearts of millions. It doesn't matter where you sit. What matters is what you do to deserve that seat. And what about you? If a small action could change someone's life, would you do it? Let us know in the comments. What's the kindest thing you've ever done? And if this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to continue spreading kindness together. See you in the next story. Barron remained silent for a long time. Then he spoke. I just thought, sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference. On the other end of the line, Clint chuckled softly. Exactly. That's what I want to capture. The idea took shape. A year later, The Power of One was released. From the moment it hit theaters, The Power of One was not just a movie, it became a movement. People walked out of cinemas with teary eyes. Stories of kindness flooded the internet. Hashtag spread like wildfire. / kindness matters. The power of one. Be the change. News articles didn't just review the film, they shared real-life acts of kindness inspired by it. A man paid off a stranger's tuition fees. A young woman helped a homeless man, only to realize he was her former teacher. An elderly couple began writing letters of encouragement to cancer patients they had never met. It all started with a moment on a plane. And in the end, when Barron stood on the stage at the award ceremony, looking down at the standing ovation that refused to die down, he was no longer just Barron Trump, the son of a former president. He was the young man who had taught the world a lesson in kindness. Before stepping off the stage, he said one simple sentence, one that would resonate in the hearts of millions. It doesn't matter where you sit. What matters is what you do to deserve that seat. And what about you? If a small action could change someone's life, would you do it? Let us know in the comments. What's the kindest thing you've ever done? And if this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to continue spreading kindness together. See you in the next story.